I stood before 150 guests at Stone Ridge Chapel, the October light streaming through tall windows like golden threads across polished oak pews. My ivory dress caught the autumn glow, the lace sleeves brushing against skin I'd moisturized 3 times that morning because my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Everything looked perfect. The arrangements of burgundy dahlias and white roses, the string quartet poised near the altar, the cake waiting in the adjoining hall with its 3 delicate tiers. Everything except the 3 rows on the left side of the aisle, the rows reserved for the bride's family, which sat completely empty. No coats draped over chair backs, no programs clutched in familiar hands, no faces turning to smile as I entered. Just polished wood and vacant space, and the crushing weight of absence so deliberate it felt like a physical wall between me and the happiness I'd spent 2 months planning. Daniel Park, my fiancé, gripped my hand tighter as we stood together at the chapel entrance. His fingers were warm and steady, but they couldn't quite mask the tremor I'd been fighting since I woke up that morning, knowing they wouldn't come. A guest in the 4th row leaned toward her companion, her whisper cutting through the string quartet's gentle melody, loud enough for me to catch every syllable. No one from the bride's side showed up? The question sliced cleanly through whatever composure I'd managed to build during the drive here, during the careful application of makeup, during the practiced smile I'd rehearsed in the mirror. But I didn't flinch. 32 years of emergency response work had taught me how to stand in the center of collapsing structures, tornadoes that shredded towns into splinters, earthquakes that turned highways into rubble, wildfires that consumed everything in their path, and keep my spine straight. I'd coordinated evacuations while wine screamed at 100 miles an hour. I directed rescue teams through flood zones where the current could pull grown men under in seconds. I knew how to function when the world crumbled. Still, this was different. This wasn't a disaster I could manage with logistics and planning. This was my father, my 2 brothers, and every single person who carried the Hayes name deciding I wasn't worth the drive to Seattle, deciding that whatever I'd done 4 years ago was unforgivable enough to erase me from their lives on the one day I'd asked them to show up. Daniel squeezed my hand once more before releasing it, his voice dropping to barely a breath. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known." I wanted to believe him. I tried to let the words settle somewhere inside the hollow space their absence had carved. But all I could think about was the last time I'd seen my father, 4 years and 3 weeks ago, standing in the driveway of his Portland home, with flames consuming the garage behind him, and hatred so pure in his eyes it might as well have been another kind of fire. The memory pulled me back before I could stop it, dragging me away from the chapel and the empty rows and Daniel's steady presence beside me. It pulled me back to September 2020, to heat and smoke and the choice that would split my family down a fracture line so deep it never healed. The Eagle Creek wildfire had started small, the way most disasters do. A spark and dry brush along the Columbia River Gorge, winds that happened to be blowing exactly wrong, temperatures high enough to turn every tree and shrub into kindling waiting for ignition. By the time evacuation orders reached my father's neighborhood in the hills outside Portland, the fire had already jumped 2 fire breaks and was moving faster than anyone predicted. I'd been visiting for the weekend, taking a rare Saturday off from my position as Deputy Director of FEMA Region 10, sitting at the kitchen table with my mother's old recipe box, trying to find her handwritten notes for blackberry cobbler. My father was in the garage when the alerts came through, doing what he did every Saturday morning, maintaining the 1967 Seagrave fire truck he'd spent 15 years restoring. The vehicle wasn't just metal and chrome to him, it was the crystallization of 40 years fighting fires across Oregon, the tangible proof that his career meant something, the inheritance he planned to pass to Marcus, my older brother, when he died. Only 47 of these trucks had ever been manufactured. Only 3 still existed in functional condition. Insurance estimates placed its value at $380,000. But to Richard Hayes, it was worth considerably more than that. He stood beside it when I ran outside, his hand still holding a polishing cloth, his face registering confusion and then calculation, as he looked toward the eastern hills, where smoke was beginning to stain the sky, an ugly brown-gray. The wind picked up as I watched, hot and aggressive, carrying the smell of burning timber and something chemical, Someone's shed or garage already consumed, plastics melting into toxic fumes. My phone buzzed with the evacuation notice. Level 3. Leave immediately. Do not gather belongings. My father's voice cut through the rising wind, sharp with command, honed over decades of emergency scenes. Victoria, Marcus, Colin, we've got maybe 10 minutes. Get the Seagrave out of here now. Marcus appeared from the side yard where he'd been trimming hedges, garden shears still in hand. Colin emerged from the house holding a sandwich, his day off from his paramedic shift interrupted by crisis the way every Hayes family gathering eventually got interrupted. We all moved toward the garage in synchronized response, the muscle memory of a family raised in emergency services, trained to act fast and think later. That's when I heard it. A child scream from the direction of the Chen family's cabin, high and terrified and unmistakable. The Chens lived 300 yards east in a small structure that had started as a summer retreat and gradually became their permanent home after Mrs. Chen's husband died. She was 71, living on Social Security. Raising her 5-year-old grandson Tommy after her daughter's overdose left the boy with no other family. I'd met them twice, once at a neighborhood barbecue where Tommy had shown me his collection of plastic firefighter helmets, and once when Mrs. Chen brought over a casserole after my mother's funeral, her hands shaking as she offered condolences in broken English. The cabin was already surrounded by flames when I turned to look, the dry cedar shingles catching faster than paper, smoke pouring from the eastern windows in thick black columns. Mrs. Chen lay motionless on the front steps, her body crumpled in a way that made my emergency training scream stroke or heart attack. Tommy stood beside her, his small frame shaking with sobs, his plastic firefighter helmet askew on his head as he screamed for his grandmother to wake up, time compressed into a single frozen moment of calculation. To my left, the Seagrave truck represented $380,000, 15 years of my father's retirement project, the legacy he'd promised Marcus, the symbol of everything the Hayes family stood for. To my right, a 71-year-old woman and a 5-year-old boy were about to die in a fire that was spreading faster with every second the wind blew. I'd spent 30 years in emergency management. I'd stood in coordination centers making decisions about resource allocation, about which neighborhoods to evacuate first, about acceptable losses and calculated risks. I'd been trained by the best in FEMA to think strategically, to weigh options, to choose the greatest good. But all that training crystallized into one simple truth I'd learned on my first day at the agency, words spoken by an instructor who'd worked Hurricane Katrina and never quite lost the haunted look in his eyes. In emergency response, you will face impossible choices. But remember, machinery can be replaced. Lives cannot. Marcus was already moving toward the garage, keys to the Seagrave in his hand, his battalion chief training kicking in with the same automated efficiency I'd seen him deploy at 100 fire scenes. Colin stood frozen, looking between the cabin and the truck, his face showing the same calculation I'd just finished. My father's voice rose above the wind, desperate and commanding in equal measure. "Victoria, start the truck, we don't have time!" But I was already running, not toward the garage, toward the flames. The heat hit me 15 feet from the cabin, a physical wall that made my skin tighten and my eyes water. Smoke obscured everything except basic shapes. The outline of the steps, Mrs. Chen's body blocking the door, Tommy's small form beside her. I could hear Marcus shouting behind me, his voice carrying words I couldn't quite make out over the roar of burning wood and the shriek of wind through the trees. My father's scream cut through everything else, raw with something beyond anger. "Victoria, the truck, that's everything I have left!" I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The training that had made me good at my job, that had let me coordinate responses across 7 states, that had earned me commendations and promotions and respect from people who'd been doing this work since before I was born. All of it narrowed down to the single task of reaching that child before the cabin collapsed. Tommy saw me coming and scrambled backward, his small hands pulling at his grandmother's arm, trying to drag her to safety with the desperate strength of a terrified child. I covered the last few feet in 2 strides, scooped him into my arms, and turned back toward clear air. The jacket I'd grabbed from the garage hook on instinct went over both our heads as I pushed through smoke that burned my throat and made my lungs scream for clean oxygen. Behind us, something inside the cabin gave way with a crack like thunder, support beams surrendering to heat and weight. We hit clear air 20 feet from the building. I kept moving until we reached the driveway, until my knees gave out and I collapsed onto gravel with Tommy still clutched against my chest. He was crying, his small body shaking with sobs, but he was breathing, no burns visible, no serious injuries. Alive. I looked back toward the garage just in time to see the roof cave in. The Seagrave had been there. Marcus halfway through the driver's side door, the engine refusing to turn over the way old engines do when they haven't been started in weeks. The vintage machinery that made the truck valuable also made it temperamental. 3 more seconds, and he might have gotten it running. 5 more seconds, and he could have backed it into the street. Instead, the garage roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning timber, and the truck vanished beneath debris that was already burning before it hit the ground. My father stood in the driveway, his body rigid, his face registering a sequence of emotions I'd never seen before and would never forget. Not relief that I'd survived, not joy that Tommy and I had made it out, not even concern for Marcus, who'd thrown himself clear at the last possible second and was now lying on the grass coughing but unharmed. What I saw in Richard Hayes's face was the pure, clean devastation of a man watching the last meaningful thing in his life turn to ash. The silence between us lasted maybe 3 seconds before he spoke, his voice flat and cold in a way that made the surrounding heat feel arctic by comparison. "You chose a stranger over your family." Tommy trembled in my arms, his face buried against my shoulder, his small hands gripping my jacket with white-knuckled intensity. Somewhere behind us, sirens were getting closer. The fire department responding too late to save the cabin or the garage, but maybe in time to keep the fire from spreading further into the neighborhood. Mrs. Chen was being loaded into an ambulance by paramedics who'd arrived while I was inside the smoke, her vital signs weak but present. She would survive the stroke. The doctors would stabilize her. She'd spend 3 weeks in the hospital and come out with partial paralysis on her left side, but alive, able to watch her grandson grow up. I tried to find words to explain, to make my father understand the calculation that had felt so simple in the moment and now seemed impossibly complex under his stare. "Dad, there wasn't time. I had to choose." Marcus approached from where he'd been sitting on the grass, his face streaked with soot, his hands scraped raw from his dive away from the collapsing garage. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between understanding and accusation. "You could have saved both. You could have told me to get the truck out, then gone for the kid. The engine wouldn't start. You know how temperamental—" Colin cut me off, his voice carrying an edge I'd never heard directed at me before. "You're always thinking you're so special because you work for FEMA, but you forgot that family needs saving too, and you just let Dad's legacy burn." The fire department spent 4 hours containing the blaze. By the time they finished, the garage was gone, the cabin was gone, and the Seagrave fire truck existed only as a twisted metal skeleton that insurance adjusters would photograph and value at $0 salvage. The loss report would eventually clarify something my father never mentioned during our argument. The truck hadn't been properly insured for its full restoration value. He'd let the policy lapse during my mother's illness 2 years earlier, when medical bills consumed every spare dollar. The truck was collateral for something else, something he didn't want to talk about, and its destruction meant more than just sentiment. I learned about the loan later, much later, from a letter my mother left before she died. $300,000 borrowed against the Seagrave to cover Marcus's failed construction business. Money that was supposed to be temporary, that was supposed to be paid back within a year. Instead, Marcus's business had collapsed completely, leaving my father with a debt he couldn't service and collateral he couldn't replace. When I saved Tommy Chen, I didn't just let a truck burn. I destroyed the only asset my father had left to keep his financial life from imploding. But I didn't know that then. All I knew was the look in his eyes as he turned away from me, as he walked toward the ruins of his garage without another word, as Marcus and Colin followed him and left me standing in the driveway with a traumatized 5-year-old still clinging to my jacket. The estrangement didn't happen all at once. It came in stages, like a wound that keeps reopening. Phone calls grew shorter, then less frequent, then stopped entirely. Holiday invitations became vague suggestions that somehow never turned into concrete plans. When I tried to visit, my father was always busy with something: a doctor's appointment, a meeting with his lawyer, repairs on the house that couldn't be interrupted. Marcus and Colin stopped responding to my messages after the first few months. Family became a thing that existed in past tense, in memories of dinners around my mother's table and summers camping in the Cascades, in a version of the Hayes family that ended the day I chose Tommy Chen's life over Richard Hayes's legacy. 4 years passed. I built a life in Seattle, threw myself into work with FEMA, coordinated disaster responses across the Pacific Northwest, and tried not to think about the empty space where my family used to be. I bought a house on the water in West Seattle, joined a hiking group, volunteered with a community emergency preparedness program. I dated occasionally, brief relationships with men who seemed nice enough, but never quite understood why family was a topic I avoided. Then I met Daniel Park at a community college disaster preparedness course I was teaching. He sat in the back row taking meticulous notes, his silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, giving him a professorial air that matched his actual profession. Recently retired literature teacher, widower of 8 years, spending his retirement learning skills he hoped he'd never need. He stayed after class to ask questions about earthquake safety, which turned into coffee, which turned into dinner, which turned into a relationship that felt different from anything I'd experienced before. Daniel understood silence. His wife had died of breast cancer after a 2-year fight that drained their savings and left him with medical debt he'd just finished paying off. He knew what it meant to lose someone slowly, to watch the center of your life dissolve while you stood helpless. When I finally told him about the fire and the choice and the 4 years of silence from my family, he didn't offer empty reassurance or advice. He just listened, his hand warm in mine, his presence steady. 2 years after that first disaster preparedness class, Daniel proposed on a rainy Saturday morning in my kitchen while I was making pancakes. The ring was simple: white gold with a small sapphire, his wife's birthstone, offered with the gentle acknowledgement that he carried his past into this future the same way I carried mine. I said yes before he finished asking, the certainty of it surprising me, the rightness of it settling into my chest like finally exhaling after holding my breath for years. Planning the wedding brought the family question to the surface in ways I couldn't avoid. Guest lists required decisions about empty spaces and missing names. Seating charts demanded answers about parents and siblings and the traditional roles they played in ceremonies designed around families that still functioned. I sent the invitations anyway, 3 envelopes addressed to Portland with handwritten notes tucked inside each one. The note to my father was the hardest to write. I went through 4 drafts before settling on words that felt honest without being desperate, that acknowledged the past without relitigating it. Dad, I know you're still hurt about the Seagrave, but do you know what happened to Tommy Chen? He's 9 years old now, in 3rd grade, dreams of becoming a firefighter like you. Every year on the anniversary of the fire, his mother sends me a photo and a thank you note. I don't regret my choice, but I regret that it cost me you. This is my only wedding. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to be there. The envelope came back 3 weeks later, unopened. No forwarding address. No return to sender marking from the post office. Just a deliberate, unmistakable rejection. The invitation placed back in its envelope and mailed back to me like returned merchandise. A text message arrived from Marcus 6 hours after the envelope landed in my mailbox, brief and brutal in its clarity. Dad said no. Colin and I agree. You chose strangers over family 4 years ago. Live with that choice. Elena Vasquez found me that evening sitting on my back deck watching the sunset over Puget Sound, the returned invitation on the table beside an untouched glass of wine. She let herself in through the side gate. We'd exchanged keys years ago during a particularly bad wildfire season, when we were both working 18-hour days and needed someone to check our houses, water plants, make sure nothing had burned down while we were deployed to disaster zones. She'd been my friend for 35 years, since we'd met during FEMA's foundational training program, when we were both 23 and convinced we could save the world through better emergency planning. She sat down across from me without asking, poured herself wine from the bottle I'd brought out but hadn't opened, and waited. Elena had worked enough crisis situations to know when silence was the right response. When I finally spoke, my voice came out rougher than I intended. "They're not coming." "I know, honey. I saw the text from Marcus. Daniel called me." I picked up the invitation, running my thumb over the return address I'd written in careful calligraphy. The effort I'd put into making it beautiful, now feeling foolish. I keep thinking there's something I could say, some way to make them understand. But I don't think understanding is the problem. I think they just don't care. Elena reached across the table and took the invitation from my hands, setting it aside with gentle firmness. They care. They care so much they can't see past their own hurt to recognize what you did was right. But that's their limitation, not yours. And Vic, you don't need them there for the wedding to be beautiful. The wedding was beautiful. Daniel's family filled the right side of the chapel, his sister and her husband, their 3 grown children, a handful of cousins who'd driven up from California, friends from FEMA, colleagues from my office, members of the hiking group I'd joined, volunteers from the emergency preparedness program. 90 people who'd chosen to be there, who'd taken time from their Saturday to celebrate with us. But those 3 empty rows on the left sat like an accusation, a visible reminder of the family that chose absence over reconciliation. When the music started and I stepped into the chapel on Daniel's arm, we'd agreed to walk in together, a small rebellion against the tradition of being given away by a father who wouldn't be there. I felt the weight of those empty rows like physical pressure. The ceremony proceeded with quiet grace. The pastor's words about love and commitment and choosing your family washed over me in waves I tried to absorb but couldn't quite hold. Daniel's vows were simple and honest, promising presence and patience and partnership, the things he'd already been giving me for 2 years. When my turn came, I'd planned to recite the vows I'd written and revised a dozen times. Instead, I looked at the empty rows, then back at Daniel, and spoke words I hadn't known I needed to say. I promise to show up, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. I promise to choose you the way I hope someone would choose me. The pastor asked the traditional question about giving away the bride, the moment in the ceremony where my father should have stood and spoken. The silence stretched for 2 heartbeats, 3, long enough for me to feel the absence settle deeper into my chest. Then Elena stood from her seat in the 3rd row, her voice carrying clear and strong across the chapel. "I stand here as Victoria's sister in service, representing 35 years of emergency response work, representing every person she's saved and every community she's helped rebuild. We give her with pride." 90 people rose from their seats in a single coordinated movement, the sound of bodies shifting and standing creating a wave of presence that filled the chapel in ways I hadn't expected. Daniel gripped my hands tighter, his eyes bright with tears he wasn't quite hiding. The pastor blinked rapidly, clearly not expecting this deviation from the script, then smiled and continued with the ceremony. In that moment, surrounded by people who'd chosen to be there, I understood something I'd been avoiding for 4 years. Family wasn't the people who shared your blood. Family was the people who showed up when showing up mattered. The reception flowed into evening, toasts and dancing and cake cutting, all the rituals of celebration that felt both traditional and revolutionary without my father there to give the standard speech, without my brothers there to share awkward jokes about childhood memories. Daniel's nephew gave a toast about meeting me for the first time and being impressed by my ability to explain earthquake preparedness in terms a 10-year-old could understand. Elena spoke about disasters we'd weathered together, about the time we'd coordinated evacuations during a flood that destroyed half a county, about the professional partnership that had grown into friendship, that felt like kinship. I danced with Daniel to a song his wife had loved, offered to him as a gift of acknowledgement that we both carried ghosts into this new beginning. I danced with Elena to something upbeat that made us both laugh. I cut cake and threw the bouquet and did all the things brides do at weddings. And underneath every moment ran the undercurrent of those empty rows, of the family that chose not to witness this, of the relationship that had died the day I prioritized a stranger's life over their pride. The hotel room that night was quiet after the noise of the reception. Daniel fell asleep quickly, the exhaustion of the day catching up to him, his breathing evening into the steady rhythm I'd grown used to over the past year of gradually merging our lives. I sat by the window looking out over Seattle's lights. My wedding dress hung carefully in the closet, the weight of the day settling into my bones. My phone buzzed with the text message at 11:47, the notification lighting up the dark room with an unwelcome glow. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, almost set the phone back down and tried to sleep, but something made me open it. The message was brief and businesslike, the kind of communication that pretended at professionalism while carrying an undertone of threat. Ms. Victoria Hayes, this is Harrison Mitchell from Harrison and Mitchell Law Firm in Portland. We represent Richard Hayes regarding estate settlement of Sarah Hayes, deceased 2020. Your presence is required at a family meeting October 25th, 2024, 2 p.m. at our offices to discuss disbursement of assets and property inheritance. Your attendance is mandatory as you are listed as a potential beneficiary. Failure to attend may result in forfeiture of all claims. Please confirm receipt. I read it 3 times, my mind struggling to process the words in the context of the day I just lived through. My mother had died 4 years ago, 3 months before the fire that destroyed the Seagrave and whatever remained of my relationship with my father. Her estate had been settled within 6 months, straightforward distribution of modest assets, the house going to my father, savings divided among the 3 children in equal shares that amounted to $45,000 each. I'd signed the paperwork without argument, relieved to have one less connection to untangle from a family that clearly wanted me gone. This message made no sense. Estate settlements didn't reopen 4 years later without significant cause. Mandatory attendance implied legal obligations I didn't understand. The phrase potential beneficiary suggested assets I didn't know existed, property my mother had never mentioned during her life or in the will I'd reviewed. I opened my email and found a formal version of the same message, sent from an official-looking firm address, with PDF attachments labeled estate notice and beneficiary requirements that my phone couldn't quite display properly in the dim light. The email's timestamp showed it had been sent at 9:41 p.m., during my wedding reception, while I was dancing with Elena, while I was trying to convince myself that the empty rows didn't matter as much as the full ones. The timing felt deliberate, designed to intrude on this specific day, to remind me that no matter how successfully I built a life separate from my father and brothers, they could still reach into it whenever they chose. I thought about ignoring it, about deleting the message and blocking the number, and going to sleep beside my new husband, without letting this poison the one day that was supposed to be about moving forward. But underneath the anger and confusion ran a thread of something else: curiosity about what my mother might have left behind, about what assets could possibly be significant enough to require a lawyer's involvement 4 years after her death, about why my father had waited until now, until the day after my wedding, to surface this. I typed a reply, keeping it brief and professional. Received, will attend. Please send full documentation regarding estate in question. The response came back within 90 seconds. Too fast for someone who wasn't waiting for my confirmation. Too immediate to be anything but planned. Documentation will be provided at the meeting. This matter requires in-person discussion per estate requirements. See you October 25th. I set the phone down and returned to watching Seattle's lights blur into watercolor patterns through the slight condensation on the hotel window. Daniel slept on, undisturbed by the text that had just cracked open a door I'd thought was permanently sealed. Outside, the city continued its Saturday night rhythms, people celebrating and mourning and living their lives in the ordinary ways that had nothing to do with empty wedding rows or mysterious estate settlements or families that couldn't forgive a choice made in 90 seconds of crisis. But I knew, with the certainty that comes from 32 years of emergency response work, that this was just the beginning of something larger. Disasters don't announce themselves with clear warnings. They start small: a spark in dry brush, a crack in a levee, a single call from a lawyer's office the day after your wedding. They start small, and they grow, and they consume everything in their path if you don't recognize the early signs and prepare accordingly. My family needed something from me. Something important enough to break 4 years of silence, to reach out on the day they knew would hurt most, to use legal language and mandatory attendance to force a meeting they couldn't achieve through simple communication. The question wasn't whether I would attend. The question was what they wanted badly enough to bring me back into their orbit after spending 4 years making sure I understood exactly how much they didn't need me. I thought about Tommy Chen, 9 years old now, third grade, dreams of becoming a firefighter. His mother sent photos every year on the anniversary of the fire. Tommy in Little League uniform, Tommy at the science fair, Tommy dressed as a firefighter for Halloween, with a plastic helmet that looked almost identical to the one he'd been wearing the day I pulled him from the burning cabin. The latest photo had arrived 2 weeks before the wedding. Tommy holding a handwritten sign. "Thank you, Ms. Victoria. You saved my life, and now I want to save others." That choice, the one my family couldn't forgive, had given a child a future, had let him grow from 5 to 9, from traumatized survivor to thriving third grader with dreams and ambitions and a life ahead of him. Whatever my father and brothers wanted from me now, whatever inheritance or property or legal obligation they were using to force this meeting, it couldn't change the fundamental mathematics of that day. I'd saved a life. They'd lost a truck. The equation had never been complex, even if they'd spent 4 years pretending it was. Daniel stirred in his sleep, one hand reaching out across the bed to where I should have been lying. I moved back to join him, settling into the warmth of his presence, letting his unconscious embrace ground me against the instability I could feel approaching. Tomorrow, we'd start our honeymoon. A week in the San Juan Islands, hiking and kayaking, and deliberately disconnecting from the world. But in 10 days, I'd be back in Portland, sitting across from my father in a lawyer's office, finding out what exactly he thought was valuable enough to make him acknowledge my existence. The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd refused to show up for my wedding, but they expected me to show up for their meeting about my mother's estate. They'd returned my invitation unopened, but they'd sent legal documents I couldn't ignore. They'd made it clear for 4 years that I was no longer family, but now they needed me to act like family long enough to sign whatever papers they'd prepared. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, Daniel's breathing steady beside me, Seattle's lights painting patterns on the ceiling through gaps in the curtains. But my mind kept circling back to the message, to the mandatory attendance, to the mystery of assets my mother had never mentioned, and an estate that had supposedly been settled years ago. My emergency management training had taught me to recognize patterns, to spot the early indicators of situations that looked simple but carried hidden complexity. This meeting had all the markers of something designed to look straightforward while concealing significant complications underneath. Whatever they wanted, I'd find out in 10 days. Whatever inheritance they thought I didn't deserve. Whatever property they'd convinced themselves should go to them instead of being divided equally. Whatever leverage they believed they had. I'd see it all when I walked into Harrison Mitchell's office and sat across from my father for the first time in 4 years. Until then, I had a honeymoon to start, a marriage to celebrate, and a life to build with the family I'd chosen rather than the one I'd been born into. But underneath everything ran the steady current of certainty that this meeting wouldn't be simple. That my father and brothers had spent 4 years nursing their grievances and building their case, and that whatever they'd planned would be designed to make me understand exactly what I'd cost them when I chose a stranger's life over their legacy. They just didn't know yet that I'd spent the same 4 years building my own life, my own career, my own resources. They thought I'd come to this meeting desperate for reconciliation, grateful for any scraps of family connection they deigned to offer. They had no idea how wrong they were. The San Juan Islands gave us 7 days of deliberate disconnection. Kayaking through kelp forests, hiking trails that wound through old-growth Douglas firs, eating fresh oysters at waterfront restaurants where nobody knew our names or our history. Daniel didn't mention the text message from the lawyer, and I didn't bring up the meeting waiting for us back in Portland. We existed in a bubble of newlywed normalcy, pretending that the world beyond Friday Harbor didn't contain complications we'd have to navigate eventually. But on the ferry ride back to Seattle, watching the islands recede into morning mist, reality reasserted itself with the weight of an anchor dropping. The meeting was in 3 days. I'd received 2 more emails from Harrison Mitchell during the honeymoon, polite reminders about the date and time, requests to confirm my attendance, subtle pressure wrapped in professional language. I'd confirmed once. The repeated requests suggested anxiety on their end, a concern that I might not show up and derail whatever plans they'd constructed around my presence. Elena met us at the Seattle Ferry Terminal, her FEMA-issued SUV idling in the pickup zone, coffee waiting in the cup holders. She hugged Daniel, then pulled me aside while he loaded our bags into the back. Her voice dropped to the confidential tone she used in disaster coordination meetings when civilian ears were nearby. I did some digging on Harrison Mitchell. His firm specializes in estate planning and probate, but he's got a reputation for creative interpretations of inheritance law. 3 complaints filed with the Oregon State Bar in the past decade, all dismissed, but the pattern suggests he walks right up to ethical lines without quite crossing them. I'd asked Elena to research the firm during our second day on the islands, texting from the kayak rental shop while Daniel was checking us in. If my family needed a lawyer with flexible ethics, that told me something about the nature of whatever they were planning. The drive back to my house in West Seattle took 40 minutes through morning traffic. Daniel went inside to unpack and start laundry, comfortable in the domestic routines we'd been building for the past year. Elena followed me out to the deck overlooking Puget Sound, where the view of water and mountains usually settled my mind, but today just reminded me how far I'd have to drive to get to Portland. She pulled out her phone and opened a notes app filled with bullet points. Here's what I found about your mother's estate settlement. Public records show the 2020 probate included the house on Hillside Drive, valued at $310,000, one checking account with $42,000, one savings account with $93,000, and a small investment portfolio worth about $78,000. Total estate approximately $523,000, divided among your father and the 3 children according to Oregon intestate succession laws, since your mother didn't have a will. I interrupted her recitation of numbers I already knew. She didn't have a will. That's what they told us. Elena's expression shifted into something sharper. Right. Except I pulled the actual probate filing from Multnomah County records. There was a will, Vic, filed 3 weeks after your mother's death, dated April 2019. Your father was executor. The will divided assets exactly the way I just described, but there's a notation on page 7 about additional properties held in a separate trust structure that would be addressed in a secondary probate proceeding pending valuation. The deck boards felt less solid under my feet. I never saw page 7. The lawyer gave us a summary, said everything was straightforward, had us sign acknowledgement forms. Who was the lawyer handling the 2020 probate? Robert Chen. He'd done work for my parents before, handled the paperwork when they refinanced the house. Elena's fingers moved across her phone screen, pulling up more information. Robert Chen, partner at Chen & Associates. Disbarred in 2022 for commingling client funds. Currently under investigation for real estate fraud in 3 counties. The coffee I'd been drinking turned sour in my stomach. My mother's estate had been handled by a lawyer who lost his license 2 years later for the exact kind of misconduct that would allow someone to hide assets from beneficiaries. The timing wasn't coincidental. The missing page 7 wasn't an oversight. Daniel appeared in the doorway with a sandwich he'd made from whatever he could find in the refrigerator. His presence a reminder that normal life continued even while I was uncovering evidence of family betrayal. He took one look at my face and Elena's rigid posture and retreated without a word, understanding instinctively when to give me space. Elena continued scrolling through her notes. I also found the business registration for SM Holdings, LLC. It was created in 1997, dissolved in 2020 right after your mother's death, then immediately reformed under the same name with your father listed as managing member instead of your mother. The dissolution and reformation happened during the same week as her funeral. The pieces were assembling themselves into a picture I didn't want to see clearly. My mother had owned properties through a separate company. Those properties weren't included in the straightforward estate settlement I'd been presented with. The company was dissolved and reformed during the chaos of her funeral, when I was too grief-stricken to ask questions about legal technicalities. And now, 4 years later, my father needed me to sign something related to those same properties. I asked the question, even though I already knew the answer would confirm my worst suspicions. Can you find out what properties SM Holdings owns? Elena had already pulled up the Oregon Secretary of State database. 3 properties. Commercial building in downtown Portland, purchased in 2003. Waterfront lot in Astoria, purchased in 2007. residential duplex in Eugene purchased in 2010. All still registered to SM Holdings as of last month. What are they worth? That's the interesting part. The property tax assessments are public record. The Portland building is assessed at $2.8 million, the Astoria lot at $2.6 million, the Eugene duplex at $1.3 million, total assessed value approaching $7 million. The number hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire I could smell but couldn't quite see. $7 million in real estate that should have been part of my mother's estate, that should have been divided among her children, that had somehow been kept separate and hidden for 4 years. And now my father needed me in a lawyer's office to discuss disbursement of assets he'd valued at a fraction of their actual worth in his initial contact. Elena's voice softened into the register she used when delivering bad news to disaster survivors. Vic, whatever they're planning, it's not about giving you your fair share. They need your signature for something, but they're not being honest about what you're signing or what it's worth. I spent the next 2 days preparing for the meeting the way I'd prepare for a disaster response deployment, gathering information, identifying resources, building contingency plans. I hired Janet Morrison, a real estate appraiser Elena recommended, to provide independent valuations of all 3 properties. I contacted Patricia Chen, no relation to the disbarred Robert Chen, an estate attorney with a reputation for aggressive advocacy and zero tolerance for fraud. I pulled every document I'd signed in 2020, every email exchange with Robert Chen, every piece of paper related to my mother's estate. Patricia Chen's office occupied the top floor of a building in Portland's Pearl District, all glass walls and minimalist furniture that suggested both success and intimidation in equal measure. She was 47, with silver streaks in her black hair, and the kind of direct gaze that made evasion impossible. I'd driven down from Seattle the day before the scheduled meeting, checking into a hotel rather than risk running into my father around Portland. She spread my documents across her conference table like evidence at a crime scene, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she worked through page after page of legal language. After 40 minutes of silence broken only by the scratch of her pen making notes, she looked up with an expression that mixed professional anger with personal offense. Her assessment came out crisp and unambiguous. They committed fraud. Whether it was criminal fraud or just civil fraud depends on how explicitly they misrepresented the assets. But at minimum, your father and this Robert Chen character violated their fiduciary duties as executor and legal counsel. You should have been informed about SM Holdings in 2020. The fact that they're contacting you now suggests they need all 3 children to sign off on something, probably selling the properties or transferring them, and they can't proceed without your consent. I'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed by someone who spent her career navigating inheritance law made the betrayal concrete in ways my own conclusions hadn't quite achieved. What leverage do I have? Complete leverage. They can't move forward without you. But Victoria, you need to understand something. If they're bringing you into this now, they've already structured things to minimize what you'll receive. Harrison Mitchell's involvement tells me they found some legal framework that technically complies with the state law while screwing you over. We need to know exactly what they're proposing before you sign anything. The morning of October 25th arrived with the kind of slate-gray Portland rain that felt appropriate for the occasion. I dressed in the charcoal suit I wore to congressional briefings when FEMA needed to justify budget requests, the armor of professional competence. Patricia Chen met me in the lobby of Harrison Mitchell's building, her presence a signal that I wasn't walking into this meeting as the desperate daughter hoping for family reconciliation. The law offices occupied the 8th floor, decorated in the studied tradition of old money, dark wood paneling, leather chairs, oil paintings of Portland's bridges in heavy gilt frames. Harrison Mitchell emerged from his inner office to greet us, his surprise at seeing Patricia barely masked by professional courtesy. He was 60-something, with the kind of careful grooming that suggested vanity disguised as attention to detail. His handshake was firm but brief, his eyes already calculating the implications of my bringing outside counsel. Ms. Hayes, I wasn't expecting you to bring representation. This is really just a family discussion about your mother's estate. Patricia's voice carried the pleasant edge of a knife wrapped in silk. Any discussion about estate assets requires legal representation. I'm sure you'd advise the same to your own clients, Mr. Mitchell. We followed him into the conference room where my father sat at the head of the table, Marcus and Colin flanking him like lieutenants positioned for battle. 4 years had carved deeper lines into my father's face, his hair gone completely white, his shoulders carrying a stoop that hadn't been there the last time I'd seen him. Marcus looked prosperous in an expensive suit that didn't quite fit right, the kind of clothing purchased to project success rather than earned through it. Colin had gained weight and lost hair, his paramedic uniform replaced by business casual that made him look older than his 56 years. None of them stood when I entered. None of them offered greetings beyond tight nods that acknowledged my presence without welcoming it. The empty chair across from my father might as well have been marked with a target, the position chosen to put me on display for their judgment. I sat down without waiting for an invitation, Patricia settling beside me with the calm of someone who'd navigated hostile family meetings before. She placed her briefcase on the table and pulled out a legal pad, pen poised like she was preparing to take depositions, rather than participate in a friendly discussion. Harrison Mitchell cleared his throat and began his prepared remarks, his tone suggesting he'd rehearsed this opening multiple times. Thank you all for coming. We're here to discuss the final distribution of Sarah Hayes' estate, specifically the assets held under SM Holdings ELLC. As you may know, these properties were kept separate from the initial probate in 2020 due to valuation complications. We've now completed that valuation and are ready to proceed with division. Patricia interrupted before he could continue. I'd like to see the documentation showing why these assets were excluded from the 2020 probate and the legal basis for that exclusion. Harrison's smile tightened. The assets weren't excluded. They were deferred pending proper appraisal. Sarah Hayes' will specified that properties held in SM Holdings should be valued independently before distribution. I'd like to see that specification in the will. Of course. He slid a document across the table, the same will I'd been shown 4 years ago, though this version included pages I'd never seen. Page 7 contained the clause Elena had found in the public records, a paragraph about SM Holdings properties requiring independent valuation before distribution to beneficiaries. I kept my voice level, professional, showing none of the anger building in my chest. I wasn't shown this page in 2020. Why not? My father spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the authority he'd used as fire chief when questioning subordinates about protocol violations. Robert Chen said it wasn't relevant until the valuation was complete. No point confusing everyone with details about properties we didn't have current values for. Patricia made a note on her legal pad, the scratch of pen on paper loud in the room's tension. Interesting interpretation of disclosure requirements. Please continue, Mr. Mitchell. Harrison pulled out a folder containing appraisal documents, property descriptions, and a proposed distribution agreement. SM Holdings owns 3 properties acquired by Sarah Hayes between 2003 and 2010. Based on recent appraisals, the total value of these assets is approximately $2.4 million. The properties are proposed to be sold with proceeds divided equally among Richard, Marcus, Colin, and Victoria, $600,000 each. The number landed exactly where I'd expected, significantly below the actual value Elena had uncovered. I glanced at Patricia, who was already reviewing the appraisal documents with the focused intensity of someone spotting obvious fraud. She didn't look up from the papers as she delivered her first strike. These appraisals are dated 2020. You're proposing distribution based on 4-year-old valuations in a real estate market that's appreciated significantly. I'd like to see current appraisals before my client signs anything. Harrison's professional composure showed its first crack. The 2020 appraisals are what was filed with the probate court. Using those values ensures consistency with the legal record. The legal record you failed to disclose to my client until 4 years after it was filed. Patricia's smile could have cut glass. We'll be getting independent current appraisals before proceeding, but let's continue. What else does this distribution agreement require? Marcus leaned forward, his voice carrying irritation that he wasn't quite managing to suppress. It requires all 4 beneficiaries to agree to sell the properties and divide the proceeds. We can't move forward unless Victoria signs. That's why we're all here. The admission confirmed what I'd suspected. They needed my signature to liquidate assets they'd been hiding for 4 years, and they'd structured the agreement to give me a fraction of what I was actually owed. The question was why now? Why the urgency? Why the risk of bringing me into this when they'd successfully excluded me from everything else? Patricia asked the question I was thinking. Why sell now? These are income-producing properties. The Portland building and Eugene duplex both have tenants. Why not continue collecting rental income? Colin answered too quickly, defensive. Because Dad needs the money. He's got medical bills, home repairs, expenses he can't cover on retirement income alone. The truth slipped out in his justification, the financial desperation that had been driving this from the beginning. My father needed cash, needed it badly enough to risk exposure, needed it enough to acknowledge my existence after 4 years of silence. But $600,000 from a $2.4 million sale wouldn't be enough to cover serious debts, which meant either the debts were smaller than they were claiming, or the actual proceeds were larger than they were disclosing. I spoke directly to my father for the first time since entering the room. "How much do you owe, Dad?" His jaw tightened, the question hitting harder than he'd expected. "That's not your concern." "It is if you're asking me to sign away property rights to help cover your debts." "How much?" Marcus cut in before my father could respond, his voice sharp. "About $340,000 in medical bills from when Mom was sick. Another $180,000 on the house mortgage that got behind during her illness. He's 65 years old, Victoria. He can't work anymore. He needs this money to survive. $520,000 in debt. Selling the properties for $2.4 million would give my father his share of $600,000, enough to cover his debts with a small cushion. But if the properties were actually worth $7 million, his real share should be closer to $1.75 million, substantially more than he needed, which raised the question of where the rest would go. Patricia pulled out her own folder, placing it on the table with deliberate precision. My client had independent appraisals conducted this week. Current market value of the Portland building, $3.2 million. Astoria waterfront lot, $2.9 million. Eugene duplex, $1.4 million. Total portfolio value, $7.5 million. The silence that followed felt like the moment before an explosion, pressure building until something had to give. Harrison Mitchell's face went through several expressions: surprise, calculation, anger, forced neutrality, before settling on professional offense. He tried to recover his authority. "Those valuations seem inflated. Real estate can vary significantly based on appraisal methodology. These appraisals were conducted by Janet Morrison, who's testified as an expert witness in 23 property valuation cases, and never had her methodology successfully challenged. Would you like to stake your professional reputation on claiming she's wrong?" My father's hands were shaking, subtle tremors that he tried to hide by gripping the edge of the table. Marcus had gone pale, his earlier confidence evaporating as his plan collapsed in real time. Colin stared at the appraisal documents like they were written in a language he didn't understand. I let the number settle before asking my next question. At $7.5 million, divided equally 4 ways, each share would be $1.875 million. You were planning to give me $600,000 and keep the difference. That's $1.275 million you were trying to steal from me. Marcus's response came out defensive and angry in equal measure. "It's not stealing. You don't deserve a full share. You abandoned this family. You let Dad's truck burn. You chose strangers over us." "I saved a child's life." "You destroyed everything Dad had left after Mom died." The words hung between us, the real grievance finally spoken aloud after 4 years of silence. This wasn't about money. It was about blame and resentment and the need to punish me for a choice they still couldn't forgive. The inheritance scheme was just a mechanism for that punishment, a way to take from me what they felt I'd taken from them. Patricia's voice cut through the tension with clinical precision. "Regardless of family dynamics, what you're proposing constitutes fraud. You misrepresented asset values, failed to disclose properties during initial probate, and attempted to coerce my client into signing away her rightful inheritance. We could file criminal charges, but I suspect you'd prefer to resolve this through proper estate distribution." Harrison Mitchell tried one more time to salvage his client's position. "Even accepting your valuations, there's the matter of estate administration costs, property maintenance expenses, legal fees, which will be detailed and documented according to Oregon probate law, not inflated to justify theft." Patricia pulled out another document, sliding it across to Harrison. "Here's a revised distribution proposal. Current market rate sales of all 3 properties, division of net proceeds after legitimate expenses, equal shares to all 4 beneficiaries. You have 48 hours to review and respond. If we don't receive acceptance, we'll file with Multnomah County Court to reopen the estate and request investigation into Robert Chen's handling of the 2020 probate." The threat landed with appropriate weight. Robert Chen was already under investigation. Connecting him to another case of estate fraud would accelerate whatever legal troubles he was facing, and potentially implicate Harrison Mitchell in the process. The calculation showed on Harrison's face as he weighed his options, and found them all leading to outcomes worse than simply giving me what I was owed. My father finally spoke, his voice rough with something that might have been shame or just exhaustion. "You'd really do this? You'd drag your own family through court, expose all of this publicly, destroy what's left of the Hayes name?" I met his eyes across the table, seeing the man who taught me about courage and sacrifice, and running toward fires instead of away from them, trying to reconcile that person with the one who'd spent 4 years plotting to cheat his own daughter. "You spent 4 years excluding me from this family. You didn't come to my wedding. You returned my invitation unopened. You made it very clear that I wasn't your daughter anymore. So don't ask me to act like family now that you need something from me." Colin tried a different approach, his voice carrying a pleading note that Marcus's anger couldn't achieve. "Vic, we're not trying to cheat you. We just thought, given everything that happened, given the truck and Dad's debts, that maybe you'd understand we need this more than you do. You've got your FEMA career, your pension, your Seattle house. We're struggling." The attempt at manipulation was transparent enough to be almost insulting. They'd structured an elaborate fraud, hidden assets for 4 years, brought me into a lawyer's office under false pretenses, and now wanted me to accept less than I was owed because they'd positioned themselves as victims who deserved my charity. Patricia gathered her documents, preparing to leave. 48 hours, Mr. Mitchell. After that, we proceed through the courts." We stood to go, but my father's voice stopped me at the door, carrying a weight I hadn't heard since the day of the fire. "Your mother wouldn't want this. She wouldn't want her children fighting over her estate, destroying each other over money." I turned back to face him, my hand on the door handle. "Mom left me a letter. Did you know that?" The question landed like a physical blow. His face went white, his body rigid. Beside him, Marcus and Colin exchanged glances that confirmed they had no idea what I was talking about. I continued, letting the truth unfold the way a fire spreads once it catches hold. "She knew what you were planning. She knew about the properties in SM Holdings. She knew you'd try to minimize my share. That's why she left instructions. Why she included that clause about extraordinary service. Why she made sure there was a paper trail you couldn't erase completely." Harrison Mitchell's expression suggested this was news to him too, that my father and brothers had kept their lawyer partially in the dark about the full extent of their mother's planning. "What clause about extraordinary service?" Patricia smiled, recognizing an opening when one appeared. "Excellent question. Let's discuss that in our 48-hour negotiation period, shall we?" We left them sitting in the conference room, their fraud exposed, their plans collapsed, their leverage evaporated. In the elevator down to street level, Patricia allowed herself a satisfied expression. "They'll settle. Harrison knows he's on thin ice professionally, and your father can't afford a court battle that would expose everything. We'll have a fair distribution within the week." The rain had stopped while we were inside, Portland's October sky clearing to reveal Mount Hood in the distance, its peak white with early snow. I stood on the sidewalk, breathing air that felt cleaner than it had in years, the weight of 4 years' silence lifting incrementally with each breath. Patricia put a hand on my shoulder, her touch brief but grounding. "You handled that perfectly. No emotion, no reaction, just facts and consequences. They expected you to be the desperate daughter begging for scraps. Instead, you showed up with lawyers and appraisals and evidence they couldn't refute." I thought about my mother, about the letter she'd left, about the way she'd protected me even after death. "I haven't actually found Mom's letter yet. I was bluffing." Patricia's laugh came out sharp and delighted. "Even better. Never tell them you were bluffing. Let them wonder what else you know." I drove back to Seattle that afternoon, the highway north following the Columbia River through the gorge where the fire had started 4 years ago. The landscape had recovered, new growth pushing through the burned areas, nature's resilience on display. But some scars remained visible if you knew where to look, patches where the fire had burned too hot for easy regeneration. Elena was waiting at my house when I arrived, having let herself in with the key she still carried. She'd made coffee and laid out dinner from the Thai place we both loved, comfort food disguised as ordinary Wednesday evening routine. Daniel was there too, his presence steady and unobtrusive, the kind of support that didn't require questions or explanations. I told them about the meeting, about Patricia's demolition of the fraud scheme, about my bluff regarding my mother's letter. Elena pulled out her laptop and opened a document she'd been working on while I was in Portland. Her expression carried professional satisfaction mixed with personal vindication. I found the letter. It took some creative research, but I located your mother's safety deposit box records. She had one at Wells Fargo on Hawthorne Boulevard, opened in 2019, never closed. Oregon law requires banks to attempt contact with the executor when box rental fees go unpaid. But if they can't reach anyone, the box stays sealed until someone with proper authorization claims it. The safety deposit box my father had either forgotten about or deliberately ignored, containing who knew what documents my mother had stored there during her final year of life. How do I access it? You're listed as a secondary authorized user. The bank has your signature on file from when your mother first opened the box. You can access it anytime during business hours. I went the next morning, driving back to Portland before I could second-guess the decision, before the weight of what I might find could talk me into staying away. The Wells Fargo branch sat in a strip mall on Hawthorne, anonymous and ordinary, the kind of place that held secrets without advertising them. The safety deposit box was small, number 347, requiring 2 keys to open, mine and the bank's. The attendant left me alone in a private viewing room, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the metal box sitting on the table like an artifact from an archaeological dig. Inside, a manila envelope, a USB drive, and a smaller sealed envelope labeled "For Victoria," open when you need strength. I opened the manila envelope first. Documents spilled out. Property deeds, trust agreements, correspondence with lawyers about SM Holdings, financial statements showing the full value of assets being hidden from probate. My mother had known, had documented everything, had left a paper trail that would support exactly the kind of legal challenge Patricia was preparing. The USB drive contained scanned copies of everything in the envelope, plus email exchanges between my father and Robert Chen discussing how to minimize my share of the inheritance, how to structure the distribution to make it look fair while giving me substantially less. The words on screen carried a casual cruelty that hurt more than the actual theft, referring to me as the problem, discussing how to handle Victoria, strategizing about what minimum amount I'd accept before fighting back. But the small sealed envelope contained something more valuable than evidence. I opened it slowly, my mother's handwriting covering both sides of a single page, dated August 2020, 1 month before she died. My dearest Victoria, if you're reading this, I've gone, and your father has done exactly what I feared he would. I need you to know the truth about the Seagrave truck, about the fire, about why your father and brothers blamed you so completely for a choice that was actually heroic. The truck wasn't just sentimental. Your father took a loan in 2018, $300,000, using the Seagrave as collateral. The loan wasn't for medical bills or house repairs. It was to bail out Marcus from a construction business that had collapsed after he made a series of terrible decisions. Your father, trying to protect his firstborn son, borrowed against the only valuable asset we owned that wasn't tied up in the house. When you saved Tommy Chen, when the garage burned, your father lost the collateral for a loan he couldn't repay. The truck's destruction meant he'd have to sell the house to cover the debt, meant his retirement would be spent in a small apartment instead of the home he'd lived in for 40 years. That's why he was so devastated. That's why he blamed you. Not because you chose wrong, but because your choice exposed Marcus's failure and your father's desperate attempt to hide it. Marcus has never told the rest of the family about the business collapse or the loan. He let you take the blame, let you be exiled from the family, because your presence was a constant reminder of his own failure. Colin went along because he's always followed Marcus's lead. And your father went along because acknowledging the truth would mean admitting he'd sacrificed his financial security to protect a son who didn't deserve it. The properties in SM Holdings came from my Uncle Simon, who left me a substantial inheritance in 1997. I kept them separate because I wanted something your father couldn't use to bail out your brothers when they made bad choices. I wanted an inheritance that would go to my children based on character, not need. That's why I included the extraordinary service clause, $500,000 extra for whichever child demonstrated exceptional commitment to saving lives and serving others. Victoria, that clause describes you. 32 years in emergency management, 1,247 people saved through your disaster response work. The choice you made to save Tommy wasn't a betrayal of family. It was the perfect expression of who I raised you to be. When your father and brothers try to take this from you, and they will try, remember that you've never owed them anything. You saved a child who would have died. You made the choice I taught you to make. And if they can't forgive you for doing the right thing, that's their failure, not yours. All my love, always, always, Mom. I read the letter 3 times, my mother's voice so clear. In the words, I could almost hear her speaking them. She'd known about the loan, about Marcus's business failure, about the real reason for my family's 4-year silence. She'd protected me with documentation and truth, giving me weapons to fight a battle she knew was coming. The extraordinary service clause she'd mentioned wasn't in the will Harrison Mitchell had shown me. That meant it existed in a different version, possibly the original before my father and Robert Chen edited it, possibly in documents they'd suppressed during probate. Patricia would need to see this, would need the ammunition my mother had left to force complete disclosure. I returned to Seattle with the USB drive and letter, with evidence of fraud and conspiracy, with proof that my family's rejection had been built on lies and financial desperation. The next morning, Patricia filed a motion with Multnomah County Court to reopen Sarah Hayes' estate, citing newly discovered evidence of material misrepresentation and executor misconduct. Harrison Mitchell called that afternoon, his voice stripped of its earlier professional confidence. They wanted to settle. Full disclosure of assets, honest appraisal, fair distribution according to the will's actual terms once we located the original version. The alternative was a court battle they couldn't win, criminal investigations they couldn't avoid, professional consequences none of them could afford. Patricia negotiated the terms with the kind of precision that came from 30 years of estate litigation. Current market sales of all 3 properties. Equal division of net proceeds among 4 beneficiaries. Additional $500,000 for me, from the extraordinary service clause once we established its legitimacy. Complete accounting of all estate assets and income since Sarah Hayes' death. And critically, a family meeting where everyone would be present, where the truth would be spoken aloud, where my father and brothers would have to acknowledge what they'd done. I didn't want the meeting. I wanted to settle through lawyers, take my money, never see any of them again. But Patricia insisted, her voice firm when I tried to argue against it. They need to say it out loud. They need to admit what they did. Otherwise, they'll just tell themselves a story where they're still the victims and you're still the villain. Trust me, Victoria, you need this as much as they do. The meeting was scheduled for November 5th at the Painted Lady, a restaurant in Newburgh that my mother had loved. Neutral territory, public enough to prevent violence, nice enough to suggest this was being taken seriously. My father, Marcus, and Colin would be there. Harrison Mitchell as their counsel, Patricia as mine, Elena as my witness, Daniel as my anchor. I had 2 weeks to prepare for a confrontation that would either heal something long broken or shatter it beyond any possibility of repair. 2 weeks to decide whether I wanted justice or revenge, whether I was strong enough to face the people who'd betrayed me with anything resembling forgiveness. The answer, I discovered, wasn't simple. I wanted them to hurt the way they'd made me hurt. I wanted them to understand what they'd cost me with their 4 years of silence. I wanted them to see me clearly for the first time in my life and recognize that the daughter they dismissed was stronger, more successful, more worthy than the sons they'd protected. But underneath the anger ran something more complicated, a thread of longing for the family we'd been before the fire, before the debts, before the choices that had split us apart. I remembered camping trips in the Cascades where my father taught me to read topographic maps. I remembered Marcus helping me with math homework when I was struggling in high school. I remembered Colin showing up at my college graduation, even though he had to work a double shift the next day. Those memories existed alongside the betrayal, the fraud, the 4 years of deliberate exile. Both truths could exist simultaneously. They'd loved me once and hurt me now. They'd raised me well and then rejected everything they'd taught me when I applied those lessons in ways they couldn't accept. Elena found me one evening sitting on my deck watching the sunset over Puget Sound. The invitation to the Painted Lady meeting printed out on the table beside an untouched glass of wine. She sat down without asking, the way she'd done 1,000 times before during deployments and disasters, and the ordinary crises of 3 decades of friendship. Her voice carried the gentle firmness of someone who'd earned the right to tell me hard truths. You don't have to forgive them, you don't have to reconcile. You don't even have to be nice. But you do have to finish this, Vic. For yourself, not for them. I knew she was right. The meeting at the Painted Lady wasn't about them getting closure. It was about me taking back the power they tried to steal, about speaking truth they couldn't refute, about showing them exactly who I'd become in the 4 years they'd refused to see me. I spent the next 2 weeks preparing the way I'd prepare for a congressional testimony, gathering facts, organizing evidence, practicing responses to anticipated questions. Patricia provided legal backup, Elena provided emotional support, and Daniel provided the steady reminder that whatever happened at that meeting, I had a life waiting for me afterward, a future they couldn't touch. The morning of November 5th arrived with clear skies and cold air, the kind of perfect autumn day that felt like a gift from weather systems that didn't care about human drama. I dressed in a navy suit that projected professional authority without trying too hard. Minimal jewelry, my mother's pearl earrings, the only sentimental touch. Daniel drove us to Newburgh, his presence in the passenger seat grounding me against the anxiety building in my chest. Elena met us in the parking lot, and Patricia pulled in moments later, her expression carrying the focused intensity of someone heading into battle. We walked into the Painted Lady together, 4 people aligned in purpose, ready to face whatever version of truth my family had constructed to justify their betrayal. The restaurant was elegant without being pretentious, white tablecloths and fresh flowers, the kind of place my mother had saved for special occasions. My father sat at the head of the table, older and smaller than I remembered. Marcus and Colin flanked him, their faces showing various degrees of defensive hostility. Harrison Mitchell occupied a chair at the far end, his posture suggesting he'd rather be anywhere else. I took the seat across from my father, Patricia beside me, Elena and Daniel completing our side of the table. The battle lines were drawn, the players positioned, and the truth was about to burn through whatever lies had sustained them through 4 years of estrangement. They had no idea what I'd found in my mother's safety deposit box. They had no idea what weapons she'd left me. They had no idea that the daughter they dismissed had spent 4 years building her own resources, her own strength, her own life. They were about to learn. The waiter poured water into crystal glasses with practiced discretion, his movements the only sound in a silence that felt like the moments before lightning strikes. The Painted Lady's dining room held other patrons, couples celebrating anniversaries, business lunches extending into early evening. But our table existed in its own isolated atmosphere, tension radiating outward in waves that made nearby diners shift uncomfortably without understanding why. Patricia opened her briefcase and arranged documents across the white tablecloth with surgical precision, each placement deliberate, each paper positioned where my father and brothers could see what evidence I'd brought. Property appraisals, bank statements, email printouts, the scattered pieces of their fraud laid out like autopsy findings. Harrison Mitchell attempted to establish some control over proceedings that were already slipping away from him. Perhaps we should order first, make this more comfortable. No, my voice came out flat and final. We're not here for comfort. We're here for truth. Marcus shifted in his chair, his expensive suit suddenly looking less like armor and more like costume jewelry, shiny but hollow. Vic, if you just let us explain. Explain what? How you valued $7.5 million in assets at 2.4? How you tried to give me $600,000 while keeping the rest? How you spent 4 years excluding me from the family, and then expected me to sign away my inheritance without question. Colin's face had gone red, the defensive anger that always surfaced when he couldn't avoid confrontation. We needed the money. Dad has debts. $520,000 in debts. I pulled out the financial documents Patricia had subpoenaed. Medical bills and mortgage arrears, which would be covered by his legitimate share of $1.875 million. So why did you need to steal from me? The question hung unanswered. the mathematics too simple to obscure with excuses. My father's hands trembled against the table edge, his silence speaking volumes that his words never could. He'd aged beyond his 65 years, the weight of whatever secrets he'd been carrying showing in the slump of his shoulders and the deep lines carved around his mouth. Patricia slid another document across the table, this one highlighted in yellow marker. This is the extraordinary service clause from your mother's original will, the version filed with the court before it was mysteriously replaced with an edited copy. $500,000 additional inheritance for the child who demonstrated exceptional commitment to saving lives through professional service. The clause specifically mentions documented rescue operations and disaster response coordination as qualifying criteria. Marcus's composure cracked further, his voice rising towards a territory that suggested panic underneath the bluster. That clause is ambiguous. I'm a battalion chief. I save lives every day. You manage fire stations and coordinate responses. Victoria has personally saved 1,247 documented lives over 32 years of disaster deployments. The difference isn't ambiguous, it's mathematical. Harrison Mitchell made one final attempt to salvage his position through legal technicality. The clause could be interpreted multiple ways. Without explicit naming of a beneficiary, Patricia's smile carried the kind of satisfaction that came from years of dismantling exactly these arguments. The clause references FEMA service specifically. Last I checked, neither Marcus nor Colin works for the Federal Emergency Management Agency. But please continue explaining how this is ambiguous. I watched my father's face as the reality settled over him. Not just that his plan had failed, but that his wife had anticipated it, had written protections against it, had known 4 years before her death that he'd try to cheat their daughter. The expression that crossed his features wasn't anger or defiance. It was shame so profound it seemed to physically shrink him. Elena leaned forward, her voice carrying the weight of 35 years watching me navigate disasters natural and familial. I worked with Victoria during the 2017 Oregon wildfires. She coordinated evacuations for 17,000 people across 4 counties, the 2019 Seattle earthquake response, the 2021 flooding in Tillamook County. She doesn't just save lives from behind a desk. She runs into the crisis while everyone else is running out. Colin tried a different approach, his tone shifting towards something that approximated pleading. None of that changes what happened with the truck. None of it changes the fact that she chose a stranger over Dad's legacy. The words triggered something in my father, a flinch that suggested Colin had just stepped on a wound that hadn't healed. His voice emerged rough and low, directed at the table rather than at any of us specifically. Stop, just stop. Marcus looked at him with confusion that bordered on alarm. Dad, we agreed to lie. My father lifted his head, meeting my eyes for the first time since I'd entered the restaurant. We agreed to blame Victoria for something that was my fault, Marcus's fault. We agreed to let her carry shame that belonged to us. The admission landed like a dropped glass, sudden and shattering. Colin's mouth opened and closed without producing sound. Marcus went very still, his earlier aggression draining away into something that looked like fear. My father continued, his words coming faster now, like a dam breaking after years of pressure. The Seagrave wasn't just sentimental. I borrowed $300,000 against it in 2018, not for medical bills, not for the house, for Marcus. Marcus's face went white. Dad, don't. Your construction business collapsed. You'd made bad deals, trusted the wrong partners, invested in projects that fell through. You lost $280,000, and you came to me because you didn't want anyone to know you'd failed. So I took out the loan, used the truck as collateral, told myself it was temporary, that you'd pay it back within a year. The story spilled out in jagged pieces, truth that had been locked away for 6 years finally finding air. Marcus had never paid it back. The business never recovered. My father had been carrying the debt alone, making minimum payments, watching interest accumulate while the value of his collateral slowly appreciated. When my mother got sick in 2018, medical bills consumed whatever extra money might have gone toward the loan. By 2020, he was drowning. When the garage burned, when the Seagrave was destroyed, I lost the only asset I could have sold to cover the debt. Insurance didn't cover it because I'd let the policy lapse during Sarah's illness. I was going to lose the house, lose everything, And it was easier to blame you than to admit I'd sacrificed our financial security to protect a son who'd failed. I felt Daniel's hand find mine under the table, his grip steady and grounding. Patricia made notes on her legal pad, documenting admissions that could be used in court if needed. Harrison Mitchell looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor, his professional reputation circling a drain of his own making. Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out strangled. I was going to pay you back. The business was supposed to turn around, but it didn't. My father's tone carried finality. It never did. And instead of being honest about the failure, we blamed Victoria. We let her think she'd destroyed something precious when actually she'd just exposed something already broken. Colin's defensive anger had evaporated, leaving behind something that looked like dawning horror. So for 4 years, we let Vic take the blame for your debt? For Marcus's business failure? We didn't go to her wedding because we were embarrassed about our own mistakes? Yes. The single word carried more weight than any explanation could have. My brothers had spent 4 years nursing a grievance built on lies. My father had spent the same time avoiding a daughter whose presence reminded him of his own poor choices. And I'd spent those years believing my family's rejection was the price of doing the right thing. I pulled out the letter my mother had left, the pages worn now from multiple readings, her handwriting still clear and precise. Mom knew. She knew about the loan, about Marcus's business, about all of it. She left me this letter explaining everything. My father's expression shifted from shame to something approaching devastation. Sarah knew? She documented everything. The loan, the business failure, your plan to minimize my inheritance. She knew you'd try to cheat me, so she left evidence I could use to fight back. That's how much she trusted you by the end. She had to build legal protections to keep you from stealing from your own daughter. The words hit harder than I'd intended, truth delivered without the cushion of diplomacy. My father's hands shook harder, his breath coming in short gasps that suggested the beginning of a panic attack or breakdown. Marcus looked like he'd been physically struck. Colin put his head in his hands. Harrison Mitchell stood abruptly, his professional composure finally collapsing completely. I need to excuse myself. This is beyond the scope of what I agreed to facilitate. He left without waiting for permission, abandoning his clients to face consequences he wanted no part of. Patricia watched him go with satisfaction, then turned her attention back to my father. Mr. Hayes, for the record, are you admitting that you knowingly misrepresented estate assets with intent to defraud your daughter of her rightful inheritance? My father nodded, the motion small and defeated. And are you willing to sign a settlement agreement that provides full disclosure and fair distribution according to your wife's actual will, including the extraordinary service clause? Another nod. Patricia produced the settlement documents she'd prepared in advance, the terms already negotiated, the numbers already calculated. $7.5 million in property sales, divided 4 ways after legitimate expenses. $1.875 million base share for each beneficiary. Additional $500,000 for me under the extraordinary service clause. Total distribution to me, $2.375 million. She placed signature pages in front of each person who needed to sign. Pen clicks loud in the resumed silence. My father signed first, his hand shaking so badly the signature looked nothing like his usual writing. Marcus signed next, then Colin, their movements mechanical. When all the signatures were collected, Patricia placed them in her briefcase with the finality of closing a case. But I wasn't finished. The legal resolution didn't address the real wound, the 4 years of exile, the wedding they'd refused to attend, the family they'd discarded the moment I'd prioritized a child's life over their financial convenience. I addressed my father directly, my voice steady despite the emotions churning underneath. You taught me to run toward fires instead of away from them. You taught me that firefighters sacrifice for people they don't know, because saving lives matters more than personal comfort. You raised me to believe that courage means doing the right thing even when it costs you something. He couldn't meet my eyes, his gaze fixed somewhere past my shoulder. And then when I applied everything you taught me, when I saved a 5-year-old child from burning to death, you punished me for it. You blamed me for your own financial failures. You let me think I destroyed your legacy when actually, I just revealed that the legacy was already destroyed. Colin interjected, his voice carrying desperate need for understanding. We were wrong. We know that now. Can't we just what? Pretend the last 4 years didn't happen? Go back to being a family like nothing changed? I shook my head. You didn't come to my wedding. You returned my invitation unopened. You made it very clear that I wasn't worth the drive to Seattle for the most important day of my life. You can't erase that with apologies and settlement agreements. Marcus's defenses had fully crumbled, leaving behind something raw. What do you want from us? You've won. You're getting your money. Patricia's got Dad's admission on record. What else? The question revealed how little he understood about what this had actually cost me. He thought it was about money, about winning, about legal victories and financial settlements. He couldn't see that I'd lost 4 years of family, that I'd walked down an aisle alone, that I'd built a life without them, because they'd made it clear there was no space for me in theirs. I want you to understand what you took from me. I kept my voice level, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I want you to know that Tommy Chen, the boy I saved, sends me a card every year on the anniversary of the fire. His mother includes photos showing him growing up, little league, science fairs, school plays. He wants to be a firefighter, like his hero who ran into the flames to save him. I pulled out my phone and navigated to the photos Mrs. Chen had sent. The progression from traumatized 5-year-old to thriving 9-year-old documented in digital images. Tommy in his Halloween costume, dressed as a firefighter with a plastic helmet. Tommy holding a sign at his school career day. When I grow up, I want to save people like Ms. Victoria saved me. I placed the phone on the table where they could all see. That's what you wanted me to let die so we could save a truck. That child, with his whole life ahead of him, with dreams and potential and a future. You wanted me to choose $380,000 of metal over him. My father finally looked at the photos, his eyes tracking across the images of a boy growing into someone who might carry forward the very values he'd once embodied. The comparison was impossible to miss. Tommy represented everything my father had claimed to stand for, while my father had spent 4 years punishing the person who'd actually lived those values. Elena spoke up, her voice carrying observations earned through decades of watching human behavior in crisis situations. I've worked with Victoria through 17 major disaster responses. I've watched her make impossible choices under pressure most people can't imagine. And the thing about her that's always been remarkable is that she never hesitates when a life is at stake. She doesn't calculate cost-benefit. She doesn't weigh property against people. She runs toward the crisis because that's who you raised her to be, Richard. The use of my father's first name, the direct address from someone outside the family, seemed to penetrate in ways our own words couldn't. He looked at Elena with something approaching gratitude for saying what he couldn't admit to himself. Daniel added his perspective, his tone carrying the gentle firmness of someone who'd watched this unfold from outside the Hayes family dynamics. I met Victoria 2 years ago at a disaster preparedness class. I didn't know about the fire or the family estrangement. I just knew she was the smartest person in the room, the one everyone deferred to when questions got complicated. When she finally told me about you, about what happened, I couldn't understand how a family could reject someone so fundamentally good. Marcus flinched at the implicit accusation. Colin stared at his hands. My father seemed to fold in on himself, the accumulation of shame and guilt finally overwhelming whatever defenses he'd maintained. I decided to deliver the final piece of information, the truth that would either liberate them from their justifications or bury them under the weight of their own miscalculations. There's something else you should know. Something I haven't told anyone except Elena and Daniel. Patricia looked at me with curiosity, unsure where this was going. I'd briefed her on the mother's letter and the property fraud, but I'd kept this last piece private, waiting for the right moment. You thought I needed this inheritance. You thought I'd be desperate for the money, that I'd accept whatever scraps you offered because I had no other options. That's why you waited 4 years to contact me. You wanted to make sure I was isolated enough, lonely enough, financially uncertain enough to take a bad deal, just to feel like I was part of the family again. The accuracy of my assessment showed in their faces, the plan I just articulated obviously matching whatever strategy they discussed. But I don't need your money. I don't need this inheritance at all. I pulled out my own financial statement, the one I'd prepared specifically for this moment. In 2001, after 9/11, I was deployed to New York City for 8 months. My husband, my first husband Jake, volunteered to go with the Portland firefighters who went to support FDNY. While we were there, we helped an elderly couple, the Steinbergs, whose son had died in the towers. We helped them navigate victim compensation, sort through their son's belongings, just sat with them when they needed company. The story emerged in careful detail, the kind of narrative that built toward inevitable conclusion. The Steinbergs had no other children, no close family. When Mr. Steinberg died in 2018, his will left me $3.2 million, with a note saying I'd reminded him of his son, the way I'd put others first, without expecting anything in return. I'd invested the money carefully, watched it grow over 6 years. My current net worth is $4.8 million. I don't need the $2.375 million from Mom's estate. I'm fighting for it because it represents Mom's belief in me, her trust that I'd earned it through the choices I made and the life I lived. But I'm not desperate. I'm not isolated. And I'm definitely not the weak, rejected daughter you thought you were dealing with. The revelation hit like a physical force. Marcus actually recoiled. Colin's mouth fell open. My father looked like I'd just told him the sun had decided to rise in the west. Patricia allowed herself a small smile, clearly enjoying the moment despite her professional neutrality. So you see, gentlemen, my client didn't come to this meeting because she needed you. She came because she needed you to understand what you'd lost when you chose pride over principle. The silence that followed felt different from the earlier tension. Less anticipatory, more processing, the atmosphere of people recalculating everything they'd thought they understood. Daniel squeezed my hand under the table, his quiet pride in me radiating through the simple touch. My father found his voice, though it emerged broken and raw. I don't understand. If you didn't need the money, why fight so hard for it? Why bring lawyers and evidence, and why put yourself through this? The question deserved an honest answer, even if the honesty hurt. Because you needed to know that when you rejected me, you weren't rejecting some desperate daughter begging for scraps. You were rejecting someone who'd built a successful life, who'd earned professional respect, who'd saved more lives than you'll ever know about. You made me feel worthless for 4 years. I needed you to understand exactly how wrong you were. Colin's voice emerged small and lost. We were so wrong about everything. Yes, Marcus tried once more to find some framework for understanding. So what happens now? You take your settlement and never speak to us again? Is this the last time we see you? The question forced me to confront what I actually wanted from this moment, beyond legal victory and emotional vindication. Did I want complete separation, the clean break I thought I needed, or was there some thread of family connection worth salvaging from the wreckage of the past 4 years? Before I could answer, Daniel's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, then showed me the screen. Mrs. Chen, asking if we were still meeting her and Tommy at the restaurant at 6 o'clock. I'd invited them weeks ago, before I'd known exactly how this confrontation would unfold, thinking their presence might serve as a living reminder of what my choice had meant. I looked at my father. There's someone I'd like you to meet, someone who's been waiting in the parking lot for the right moment, if you're willing. My father nodded, his movements tentative, unsure what additional blow was coming. I texted Mrs. Chen to come inside, then waited while the seconds ticked past, each one feeling longer than it should. The restaurant door opened. Mrs. Chen entered first, her gait still slightly uneven from the stroke, but remarkably recovered for a 75-year-old woman who'd been given 50-50 odds of walking again. Behind her came Tommy Chen, 9 years old now, wearing his Sunday best, khaki pants and a button-down shirt, his hair neatly combed, his expression showing nervous excitement. Tommy spotted me and broke into a grin that could have powered the entire restaurant. "Ms. Victoria!" He ran over, and I stood to hug him, this child I'd pulled from flames 4 years ago, now growing into someone remarkable. Mrs. Chen followed more slowly, her English still heavily accented, but her smile universal. "Thank you for inviting us. Tommy has been so excited." I guided them to our table, pulling out chairs, making introductions. "Tommy, Mrs. Chen, I'd like you to meet some people. This is my father, Richard Hayes. He was a fire chief in Portland for 40 years. Tommy's eyes went wide with the kind of hero worship only 9-year-olds can fully embody. "You were a real fire chief, like in the movies?" My father stared at Tommy like he was seeing a ghost. The abstract concept of the child Victoria saved, suddenly concrete and real in the form of this bright-eyed boy who couldn't stop bouncing with excitement. "Yes, I was. Ms. Victoria saved my life. Did she tell you? There was a big fire, and she ran in and carried me out. The cabin fell down right after. If she hadn't come, I would have died. The words, spoken with childlike directness, carried more impact than any of my accusations or Patricia's legal arguments. This was the actual consequence of my choice. Not theoretical, not abstract, but sitting here alive and enthusiastic and full of potential. Mrs. Chen addressed my father with the formal courtesy of her generation. My grandson talks about your daughter every day. She is his hero. He wants to be firefighter because of her. She gave him life, gave me my family. We can never repay. Tommy pulled out a notebook from his backpack, showing my father pages of drawings, fire trucks, firefighters in gear, buildings with flames, and stick figures being rescued. I practiced drawing emergency scenes. When I grow up, I want to save people like Ms. Victoria saved me. I want to be brave like her. My father's hands trembled as he looked at the drawings, at this living testament to a choice he'd spent 4 years condemning. A child who'd been 5 was now 9, would be 13 in 4 more years, would graduate high school, and maybe attend the fire academy and carry forward a legacy more meaningful than any restored truck. Marcus and Colin watched Tommy with expressions that suggested their entire framework for understanding the past 4 years was crumbling in real time. This wasn't a stranger. This was a specific human being with dreams and artwork and a grandmother who loved him. This was the price tag they'd wanted me to refuse. Tommy addressed Marcus directly, unaware of the complex dynamics at the table. Are you a firefighter too? Ms. Victoria said her brothers fight fires. Marcus managed to find his voice. I'm a battalion chief. I coordinate fire responses across 3 stations. That's so cool. Maybe I can work for you someday when I'm a firefighter. The innocent enthusiasm, the assumption of a future that had almost been extinguished, hit harder than any accusation could have. Marcus nodded, unable to form words, his face showing something that might have been grief or shame or belated understanding. My father finally spoke to Tommy, his voice carrying the gentleness he'd once used with me when I was young. What's your favorite part about firefighting? Tommy didn't hesitate. Saving people, making sure everyone gets out safe, being the person who runs in when everyone else runs out. Ms. Victoria taught me that's what real heroes do. The phrase, running in when everyone runs out, echoed words my father had spoken to me countless times growing up, the fundamental principle he'd built his career around, and then somehow forgotten when it mattered most. Hearing them reflected back through this child seemed to break something final in his defenses. His voice emerged barely above a whisper. She's right. That is what heroes do. Tommy beamed, then launched into an animated explanation of his school's career day presentation. His plans to volunteer at the fire station when he was old enough. His determination to make sure no other families had to experience what his grandmother had gone through. Mrs. Chen watched her grandson with the kind of fierce love that transcends language barriers, her gratitude toward me evident in every glance. After 15 minutes of Tommy's enthusiastic chatter, Mrs. Chen gently guided him toward the restaurant's outdoor seating area where she'd ordered hot chocolate for them to share, while the adults finished their discussion. Tommy hugged me goodbye, then surprised everyone by hugging my father too, his child-sized arms barely reaching around the old man's shoulders. It was nice meeting you, Mr. Fire Chief. Thank you for teaching Miss Victoria to be so brave. The words landed like absolution my father didn't deserve, grace offered by someone too young to understand what he was forgiving. After they left, the table sat in renewed silence, but this time the quiet felt different, less hostile, more contemplative, the air cleared by truth even if wounds remained unhealed. My father spoke first, addressing me directly for what felt like the first time in years. I was wrong, about everything, about blaming you, about the 4 years of silence, about trying to cheat you out of your inheritance. But mostly I was wrong about Tommy. I'd convinced myself he was just some stranger, that saving him wasn't worth what we lost. But he's not a stranger. He's a boy who wants to be a firefighter because of you. He's carrying forward everything I ever tried to teach you. The admission cost him something visible, his posture folding further, his age showing in every line of his face. Marcus cleared his throat, his own voice rough with emotion he'd been suppressing. I'm sorry, Vic. I let you take the blame for my failure. I let Dad protect me instead of being honest about the business collapse. I let you walk through 4 years of exile because it was easier than admitting I'd screwed up. You deserved better. You deserved the truth. Colin nodded his agreement. His earlier defensive anger completely evaporated. When you didn't come to family things, when you stopped calling, I told myself it was because you'd chosen your FEMA career over us. I didn't want to admit we'd pushed you away. I'm sorry. The apologies hung in the air, sincere but insufficient, unable to erase 4 years of damage, no matter how heartfelt. Patricia gathered her documents, recognizing that her role in this had concluded, that what remained was family business beyond the scope of legal representation. I took a breath, trying to find words for the complex truth of what I felt. I don't know if I can forgive you yet. The hurt is too recent, too deep. You made me feel worthless for 4 years. You rejected me on my wedding day. You tried to steal from me using the legal system. Those aren't small things that apologies can fix quickly. My father nodded understanding. What would you need to even consider forgiving us? Time, honesty, proof that you actually understand what you did wrong and why it was wrong. And most importantly, I need you to rebuild trust through actions, not words. Words are cheap. You've proven that. Elena interjected with practical wisdom. Rebuilding trust takes years, Richard. It took you 1 day to destroy it, and 4 years to compound the damage. You don't fix that in an afternoon at a restaurant, no matter how good the apologies sound. Daniel added his perspective. Victoria has built a life without you. A good life. With people who show up for her, who value her, who don't punish her for doing the right thing. If you want to be part of that life, you have to earn the privilege. It's not owed to you just because you're family. The truth of his words settled over the table like winter frost. Cold, but clarifying. My father and brothers had spent 4 years thinking I needed them, that family obligation would eventually bring me crawling back. They'd miscalculated catastrophically, and now faced the reality that I'd thrived in their absence. Patricia stood to leave, her professional obligations fulfilled. The settlement will be finalized within 30 days. Proceeds from the property sales will be distributed according to the agreement you signed. My advice, Mr. Hayes, is to use your share to clear your debts and rebuild your financial stability. And maybe spend some of it on therapy to address why you thought cheating your daughter was an acceptable solution to your problems. She left with Elena, the two of them giving me space to finish this conversation without audience. Daniel squeezed my hand and followed them, understanding that some things needed to happen within the family alone, even broken families trying to find their way back to function. My father looked older without the buffer of other people, the weight of his choices showing in every movement. What happens now? Do we just go back to our separate lives, never speak again? The question demanded an answer I wasn't sure I had. Did I want complete severance? The clean break that would let me move forward without the complications of reconciliation? Or was there value in leaving the door open, in allowing the possibility of healing, even if it took years to achieve? I thought about my mother's letter, about her protecting me even after death, about her belief that I'd earned my inheritance through character and choices. She'd wanted me to have the resources to fight back, but I didn't think she'd wanted permanent family destruction. She'd loved my father despite his flaws, had raised my brothers with the same care she'd given me. I don't know what happens next, but I know I'm not ready to pretend everything is fine. I'm not coming to family dinners or holiday gatherings like nothing happened. If we rebuild anything, it starts from zero, with you proving you've actually changed, not just apologizing because you got caught. Marcus leaned forward, desperation creeping into his tone. What would that look like? What do we need to do? For starters, you could acknowledge Tommy's existence publicly. Donate to the Fire Safety Foundation in his name. Show me you actually understand that saving him was the right choice, not just the choice I made. Show me you value human life over property. Colin nodded slowly. We can do that. And you could attend family therapy. All three of you. Work through whatever toxic thinking led you to believe cheating me was justified. Figure out why Marcus's pride was more important than honesty. Why Dad's financial mistakes were worth destroying our family over. Why Colin went along with all of it instead of standing up for what was right. The suggestions landed with appropriate weight, asking more than token gestures, demanding actual work toward change. My father absorbed each requirement with visible effort, the reality of what rebuilding would cost settling over him. We'll do it, whatever it takes. I stood, ready to leave this restaurant and this confrontation behind. Don't promise me whatever it takes. Just promise me you'll try. And then actually try. Show up consistently. Be honest. Value people over pride. Do those things for long enough, and maybe someday we can be family again. The conditional nature of my statement, maybe someday, was the best I could offer. Forgiveness wasn't a switch I could flip because they'd finally admitted the truth. It was a process that would take time and effort and consistent demonstration that they'd actually internalize the lessons this disaster had taught them. I left them sitting at the table, 3 men facing the consequences of their choices. The settlement agreement signed, but the emotional work just beginning. Daniel waited for me outside, his arms open, his presence the kind of uncomplicated support that reminded me why I'd chosen him. Why the family you build matters as much as the family you're born into. 6 months later, Portland's Rose Festival brought the kind of perfect June weather that made people forget the city's 9 months of rain. Daniel and I drove down from Seattle for the weekend, accepting an invitation my father had extended with appropriate tentativeness, making no assumptions about my attendance until I'd confirmed. The festival grounds along the waterfront hummed with activity. Carnival rides, food vendors, flower displays that justified the event's name. My father had suggested meeting at the fountain near the Rose Garden, neutral territory that held no family history, no emotional landmines. He looked better than he had at the restaurant 6 months ago. The settlement had allowed him to clear his debts, and the absence of that financial pressure showed in his posture, in the color returning to his face. Marcus and Colin flanked him as before, but the dynamic felt different, less like lieutenants supporting their commander, and more like equals uncertain of their standing. Tommy Chen was there too, invited by my father as proof of the kind of change I demanded. The boy had grown in 6 months, his face losing baby roundness and gaining the angles of approaching adolescence. He wore a junior firefighter t-shirt from the Portland Fire Bureau's youth program, evidence that my father had followed through on the commitment to support Tommy's interests. Tommy ran up to me with the same enthusiasm he'd shown at the restaurant, his hug fierce and genuine. "Ms. Victoria, guess what? Chief Hayes has been teaching me about fire safety. I gotta visit the fire station and sit in the trucks and everything." The title, Chief Hayes, suggested a relationship that had developed between my father and this boy, mentorship filling space that might otherwise have remained empty. My father confirmed it with quiet pride that felt different from his earlier need to prove worth through possessions. "Tommy's been coming to the station twice a month. We're teaching him basics, fire triangle, evacuation procedures, how to check smoke detectors. He's a good student, asks smart questions." The interaction between them showed genuine affection. My father engaging with this child he'd once dismissed as a stranger, worth less than a truck. Tommy chattered about everything he'd learned, demonstrating proper stop-drop roll technique, explaining the difference between Class A and Class B fires with the seriousness of someone who'd studied hard. Mrs. Chen watched from a nearby bench, her smile carrying gratitude and something else. Forgiveness for a man who'd initially valued metal over her grandson's life, but was now investing in his future. She waved to me, gesturing that I should stay with my family, that Tommy was in good hands. Marcus approached with visible hesitation, his earlier confidence replaced by something humbler. "Vic, I wanted you to know I've been in therapy like you suggested. Individual sessions, not just family counseling, working through why I needed Dad to bail me out instead of being honest about my business failure." Colin added his own update. "I've been going too, talking about why I always went along with Marcus instead of thinking for myself. My therapist says I have some work to do on personal accountability." The progress felt real, not performative, the kind of slow change that came from actual effort rather than quick fixes designed to win me back. My father had been attending sessions as well, working through his own patterns of protecting his sons at the expense of his daughter, examining why financial stability had mattered more than emotional honesty. We walked through the festival together, the 5 of us, my father, brothers, Tommy, Daniel, and me, navigating the complicated territory of family that was broken, but maybe healing. The conversation stayed surface level, discussing roses and festival food and Tommy's school performance, avoiding the deeper wounds that still needed time to fully close. But underneath the small talk ran an undercurrent of possibility. The recognition that we'd survived the worst of the fire and were figuring out how to rebuild in the aftermath. It wasn't forgiveness yet, it wasn't reconciliation, but it was forward motion, which felt like enough for now. Elena and her partner joined us later, expanding our group, adding the buffer of chosen family to the tension of blood relations. We ate festival food and watched Tommy win a stuffed animal at the ring toss, and pretended this was something approaching normal. As the sun set over the Willamette River, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, I stood slightly apart from the group watching them interact. Daniel beside me, his hand warm in mine. My father teaching Tommy how to identify different types of fire trucks. Marcus and Colin actually laughing at something Elena said. The fragments of families scattered and reassembling into new configurations. Daniel's voice came quiet beside me. You doing okay? Whoa, okay? Yeah, it's strange, but okay. Think you'll ever really forgive them? The question deserved honest consideration. I don't know. Maybe. They're trying, which is more than I expected 6 months ago. But forgiveness isn't required for us to have some kind of relationship. Maybe we can just be people who share DNA and are learning to be civil to each other. That might be enough. You're allowed to want more. You're also allowed to want less. I leaned into him, grateful for permission to feel complicated emotions without pressure to resolve them neatly. The rose garden spread out before us, thousands of blooms in every color, beauty growing from careful tending and proper conditions. Maybe family was like that, requiring attention and time and the right environment to flourish. Tommy ran over, his stuffed animal clutched under one arm. Ms. Victoria, Chief Hayes says when I'm 16, I can apply to the junior firefighter program. That's only 7 more years. His enthusiasm was infectious, his future spreading out before him in possibilities that almost hadn't existed. I ruffled his hair affectionately. You'll be amazing at it. Just remember. Run toward the crisis when everyone else runs away. I know. You told me. He darted back to show my father his prize, leaving me with the echo of words I'd inherited from the man who'd rejected me and was now teaching them to the boy I'd saved. The circle felt complete in ways I hadn't expected, the legacy passing forward through generations with modifications and growth. As we prepared to leave, my father approached me alone, his steps careful, his expression showing the vulnerability of someone who'd burned bridges and was trying to rebuild them from charred remains. Thank you for coming today, for giving me a chance to show you I'm trying. You're welcome. I know 6 months doesn't erase 4 years. I know I have years of work ahead to earn back any trust. But I want you to know, seeing you with Daniel, seeing the life you've built, seeing how successful you are without us, I'm proud. I should have said that 4 years ago. I should have said it your whole life. But I'm saying it now. The words landed with bittersweet impact, meaningful but overdue, appreciated but insufficient. Thank you. And about Tommy. You were right to save him. The truck was just metal. Tommy is a person with a whole life ahead. I was wrong to make you choose between them. I was wrong about everything. I nodded, accepting the apology without quite absolving him of guilt. The important thing is you understand that now, that you're building a relationship with Tommy that honors the choice I made. He's a good kid. Reminds me of you at that age. Curious, determined, wanting to help people. I missed it seeing you grow up from that curious kid into the woman you are now. I'd like to not miss any more if you'll let me. The request hung between us, asking for grace I wasn't sure I was ready to give but couldn't quite refuse. We'll see. Keep doing what you're doing. The therapy, the honesty, the relationship with Tommy. Show me consistent change over time. That's what rebuilds trust. He nodded understanding and stepped back, giving me space, respecting boundaries he'd violated so catastrophically before. Daniel guided me toward our car, his arm around my waist, his presence steadying. On the drive back to Seattle, watching the landscape change from Portland's bridges to the forests north of the Columbia, I thought about the question of legacy that had driven so much of this conflict. My father had built his identity around the Seagrave truck, seeing it as proof of his worth and the inheritance he'd leave behind. When it burned, he felt like his legacy had been destroyed. But Tommy Chen represented a different kind of legacy, the impact of choices made in crisis, the ripple effects of prioritizing human life over material value, the way one decision could change the trajectory of a future. In 7 years, Tommy would apply to the junior firefighter program. In 10 or 12, He might attend the fire academy. In 15, he could be the one running into burning buildings, saving other families, passing forward the values my father had taught me and I demonstrated, and he was now teaching Tommy. That legacy, built on actions rather than possessions, on character rather than collateral, felt more durable than anything made of metal. It couldn't be destroyed by fire or stolen by fraud or diminished by time. It lived in the people who carried it forward, in the choices they made, in the lives they touched. Daniel reached over and squeezed my hand, pulling me back from contemplation into present moment. The road stretched ahead, Seattle waiting at the end of it, our life together continuing regardless of what happened with my family of origin. That life, built with intention, sustained by genuine connection, grounded in mutual respect, was the real victory, the evidence that I'd survived the fire and built something stronger in its aftermath. People ask me sometimes if I regret the choice I made that September day in 2020. The answer is simple: never. Not for a single second. I lost a truck, but I saved a life. I lost 4 years with my family, but I found out who I was without them. I lost the comfort of unquestioned belonging, but I gained the strength that comes from standing alone when necessary. My mother taught me to see truth when others saw only numbers. She left me weapons to fight battles she knew were coming. She believed I'd earned my inheritance through character. And she was right, though the inheritance I value most isn't measured in millions, but in moments. Moments like Tommy's hug at the festival. Moments like my father's tentative pride. Moments like Daniel's steady presence through every crisis. Legacy isn't what you leave behind in bank accounts or restored vehicles. Legacy is what you plant in others through your choices and actions. What grows and spreads and changes the world in ways you'll never fully see. Tommy Chen will save lives someday. Those people will go on to have children and grandchildren, to make their own impacts, to spread good through the world in expanding circles of influence. That started because on one September day, when fire forced an impossible choice, I ran toward the crisis instead of away from it. I chose a stranger's life over family pride. I chose correctly. And I'd make that same choice again every single time.